The plasma round screamed past Marcus Chen's head, searing the air with acrid ozone as he pressed his back against the crumbling concrete barrier. His tactical vest hung in tatters, 3 puncture wounds slowly seeping crimson through the synthetic fabric. The weight of his rifle felt like a mountain in his trembling hands, but his weathered face bore something that shouldn't have existed in this hellscape, a grin. "Chen, status report." The voice crackled through his damaged comm unit, barely audible over the thunderous barrage of enemy fire that had been pounding their position for the past 6 hours. "Still breathing, Captain," Marcus shouted back, his voice hoarse but carrying that distinctive note of dark humor that had earned him both respect and bewilderment among his fellow mercenaries. "Though I gotta say, the hospitality here leaves something to be desired." The irony wasn't lost on him. 3 days ago, he'd been sharing drinks with his unit in the orbital station's cantina, joking about retirement and the beach house he'd never afford. Now, half his squad was dead, their bodies scattered across the lunar mining facility like broken dolls, and the rest were trapped in what used to be the command center, surrounded by an army of Zephyrian warriors whose chittering war cries echoed through the artificial atmosphere like the songs of mechanical demons. Marcus had seen enough battles to know when one was truly lost. This was one of those times. The Zephyrians were methodical in their brutality. Standing nearly 8 feet tall on their insectoid legs, their exoskeletons gleamed like polished obsidian under the facility's dying emergency lights. Their compound eyes reflected no mercy, no understanding of human concepts like surrender or negotiation. They had come to this remote mining outpost for one reason: to eliminate every trace of human presence and claim the rare quantum crystals buried deep in the moon's core. What they hadn't expected was Marcus Chen. Movement on the east corridor. Sergeant Torres called out, her voice strained. She'd taken shrapnel to her left arm hours ago, but the woman refused to slow down. 5 of them. Marcus swung around the barrier, his rifle bucking in his hand as he sent a burst of kinetic rounds downrange. The tungsten slugs sparked against Zephyrian carapaces, and one of the aliens stumbled, dark ichor spraying from a crack in its thorax. But they kept coming, their plasma weapons charging with that distinctive whine that had become the soundtrack to humanity's nightmares. "You know what's funny?" Marcus called out as he ducked back into cover, reloading with practiced efficiency. A plasma bolt sizzled overhead, melting a chunk of the wall above him. "My ex-wife always said I'd die laughing at something that wasn't funny. Chen, what the hell is wrong with you?" Torres demanded, but there was something in her voice, not quite admiration, but a recognition that his insane levity was somehow keeping them all from complete despair. The truth was more complicated than Marcus could explain in the middle of a firefight. Laughter had always been his defense mechanism, his way of processing the impossible situations that military life and later mercenary work had thrown at him. He learned it during his first deployment with the Colonial Marines when he watched his best friend get torn apart by a hive queen's mandibles. Instead of screaming or breaking down, he'd started laughing. Hysterical, maybe, but it had kept him functional when functionality was the difference between life and death. The Zephyrians had been at war with humanity for 17 years now, ever since first contact had gone catastrophically wrong. What had started as a diplomatic mission to establish trade relations had ended with the alien delegates slaughtering the entire human negotiation team and declaring humanity an inferior species marked for extinction. The war that followed had been brutal, spanning dozens of star systems and costing millions of lives on both sides. Marcus had been fighting in that war for 12 of those 17 years. First as a Marine, then as part of an elite special operations unit, and finally as a freelance mercenary when the military bureaucracy had become too much to stomach. He'd seen humanity's greatest victories and most crushing defeats. He'd watched entire colonies burn and celebrated the destruction of Zephyrian fleet formations. Through it all, he'd maintained that same dark sense of humor that now echoed through the mining facility's corridors. Thermal charges set on the south entrance. Corporal Kim's voice was tight with concentration. 60 seconds. Copy that, Marcus replied, then muttered under his breath, 60 seconds to live or die. Wonder what the odds are in Vegas. The Zephyrians were adapting to their tactics with frightening speed. What had started as a frontal assault had evolved into a sophisticated siege, with the aliens using their superior numbers and technology to systematically eliminate escape routes and defensive positions. Marcus could hear the scraping of their claws on metal, the chittering communication that sounded like breaking glass mixed with grinding gears. But he could also hear something else, the labored breathing of his remaining teammates, the quiet prayers muttered in 3 different languages, the soft crying of the civilian miners they'd been hired to evacuate and had failed to save. These sounds were what really mattered. Not the strategic situation or the tactical odds, but the human element that the Zephyrians could never understand. Chen, Captain Rodriguez's voice came through the calm, weaker now. The man had taken a direct hit to his chest plate earlier, and the medical foam could only do so much. I need you to know something. Save the deathbed confessions for later, Cap, Marcus replied, but his tone was gentler. We're not done yet. The evacuation data, Rodriguez continued, each word an effort. It's not just about the miners. The quantum crystals, if the Zephyrians get them, they can power their fleet for 1,000 years. Every human world becomes a target. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd known this job was important. The pay scale had made that clear, but the full implications were just hitting him. This wasn't just about a remote mining facility or even the lives of 47 trapped miners. This was about the entire trajectory of the war. So what are you saying, Cap? I'm saying we can't let them take this facility intact. The demolition charges are still active, but someone needs to stay behind to trigger them manually. Someone needs to say no more, Marcus interrupted, and this time his laughter was quieter, more thoughtful. Always wanted to go out with a bang. The thermal charges detonated right on schedule, sending a shockwave through the facility that knocked dust from the ceiling and made the artificial gravity fluctuate. Through the smoke and debris, Marcus could see Zephyrian forms moving with renewed urgency. They'd realized what the humans were planning. All right, people, Marcus called out, his voice carrying across the command center. Time for the grand finale. Torres, Kim, get everyone to the emergency pods. I'll buy you as much time as I can. We're not leaving you behind, Torres protested. Yes, you are, Marcus replied firmly. And you're going to tell everyone what happened here. Tell them about the miners who died protecting those crystals. Tell them about Rodriguez and his bad jokes. Tell them about Patel and how he always shared his rations with the rookies. Tell them that some humans fought to the very end and then went out laughing. The Zephyrians broke through the eastern barricade in a surge of chitin and plasma fire. Marcus opened up with everything he had, his rifle set to full automatic, the barrel glowing cherry red from sustained fire. One alien fell, then another, but more kept coming. Their return fire was precise and overwhelming, designed to incapacitate rather than kill outright. That was when Marcus realized they weren't trying to eliminate him. They were trying to capture him. The revelation hit him just as a plasma bolt caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into a bank of computer terminals. Pain exploded through his nervous system, but he managed to keep hold of his weapon. Through the haze of agony and adrenaline, he saw the Zephyrians advancing more cautiously now, their weapons aimed, but not firing. Well, he gasped, struggling to his feet. Looks like someone wants to have a conversation. The largest Zephyrian stepped forward, its compound eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that was somehow both alien and uncomfortably familiar. When it spoke, its voice was a harmony of chittering sounds that his universal translator struggled to process. Human warrior, the creature said, the mechanical translation making its words sound flat and emotionless. You will come with us. Your death will serve a greater purpose. Marcus looked around the command center. His teammates were gone. He could hear the distant sound of escape pods launching, carrying the survivors to safety. The demolition charges were armed and ready, waiting for his authorization code. All he had to do was speak 10 words, and this entire facility would become a funeral pyre hot enough to melt quantum crystals into radioactive slag. Instead, he started laughing. It wasn't the forced humor he'd been using to keep morale up during the firefight. This was something deeper, more genuine, the laughter of a man who'd suddenly understood the cosmic joke that was his entire existence. Here he was, a 34-year-old ex-Marine from New Detroit, standing in a shot-up mining facility on a nameless moon, facing down an army of alien warriors who wanted to drag him off for purposes unknown. The absurdity of it all hit him like a physical force. "You know what?" he said between fits of laughter, his voice echoing off the damage walls. "I think I'd like to see where this goes." The Zephyrians exchanged rapid clicking sounds that his translator couldn't parse. Their body language, if it could be called that, suggested confusion, perhaps even concern. Marcus got the distinct impression that his reaction wasn't what they'd expected. "You will cooperate?" the lead Zephyrian asked. "Oh, I'll cooperate," Marcus replied, still chuckling as he let his rifle clatter to the floor. "But I should probably warn you, I'm a lot more fun at parties than I am under interrogation." As the aliens moved to restrain him, Marcus caught sight of his reflection in a broken monitor screen. His face was streaked with blood and grime, his tactical gear was in ruins, and his left shoulder hung at an unnatural angle. But his eyes were bright with manic amusement, and his grin was wider than it had been in years. The demolition charges would remain unarmed. The quantum crystals would fall into Zephyrian hands. The war would continue, and humanity would face new threats because of his decision. But as the alien secured his hands with restraints that felt like liquid metal solidifying around his wrists, Marcus found himself genuinely curious about what came next. After all, he'd never been tortured by aliens before. There was a first time for everything. Act 2. The warlord's curiosity, the Zephyrian command ship Severed Claw, was a monument to alien engineering and martial philosophy. Its corridors stretched for miles through the vessel's organic-looking hull, walls that seemed to pulse with their own life and floors that gave slightly underfoot as if walking on cartilage. Bioluminescent strips provided a sickly green illumination that hurt human eyes, and the air carried a constant undertone of chemical scents that Marcus's brain couldn't quite categorize, something between ozone and decay, with hints of metal and ancient dust. Marcus had been aboard for 6 days now, though time was a fluid concept in the ship's artificial environment. They moved him to a series of holding cells, each one slightly different from the last, each one designed to break down his psychological defenses through environmental manipulation. Temperature fluctuations that went from Arctic cold to tropical heat in minutes, sounds that ranged from absolute silence to cacophony of grinding metal and alien screams. Light patterns that strobed and shifted in frequencies calculated to induce disorientation and despair. Through it all, Marcus had maintained his sense of humor. You know, he told his current guards, 2 smaller Zephyrians whose carapaces bore the ritual scarring of warrior caste individuals, back home, we'd pay good money for this kind of sensory experience. There are clubs in Neo-Tokyo that would kill for your lighting setup. The guards didn't respond. Marcus wasn't sure if they understood his words or if they were simply following orders to ignore him. But he kept talking anyway, partly because the silence was more unsettling than any torture device, and partly because he'd noticed something interesting about Zephyrian behavior patterns. They were studying him. It was subtle. The way their compound eyes tracked his movements, the slight tilt of their heads when he made jokes, the clicking sounds they made to each other when they thought he wasn't paying attention. Marcus had spent enough time in intelligence briefings to recognize reconnaissance when he saw it, even when it was being conducted by 8-foot-tall insectoid warriors from another star system. The questions had started on day 3. Not torture exactly, though the interrogation chamber they'd moved him to was clearly designed for intimidation. The walls were covered in what looked like trophies, pieces of armor and equipment from various species, most of which Marcus didn't recognize. Human items were prominently displayed: a colonial marine helmet, a Section 31 combat knife, dog tags from soldiers who died in battles across the galaxy. The interrogator was different from the other Zephyrians Marcus had encountered. Smaller, with a more streamlined carapace that suggested speed rather than brute strength. Its compound eyes were larger, more expressive, and when it spoke, the words came out in perfectly enunciated galactic standard rather than the mechanical translations he'd grown used to. "I am Interrogator Prime Vexhi," the creature had said, settling into a crouch that brought its head level with Marcus's. "I have studied your species for many cycles. You fascinate me." "Well, that's flattering," Marcus had replied. "Though I should mention, I'm not really representative of humanity as a whole. Most people think I'm a little nuts." "Nuts," Vexi had repeated, seeming to taste the word. "Your language contains many such expressions, idioms that convey meaning beyond their literal interpretation. This suggests a complex relationship between thought and communication." "Or it suggests we like to make simple things complicated," Marcus had countered. "Depends on your perspective." The interrogation sessions that followed were unlike anything Marcus had experienced or trained for. Vexi wasn't interested in military intelligence or strategic information. Instead, the Zephyrian asked questions about human culture, psychology, and behavior patterns. Why did humans form emotional attachments to inanimate objects? How did they rationalize self-sacrifice for abstract concepts like honor or duty? What evolutionary purpose did humor serve in a species facing extinction? Marcus had answered honestly, partly because he saw no strategic value in the information and partly because he found the conversations genuinely interesting. Vexi was clearly intelligent, with a perspective on humanity that was both alien and surprisingly insightful. The creature's questions forced Marcus to think about aspects of his own nature that he'd never examined before. But it was during the fourth session that things had taken a darker turn. "Your emotional responses are atypical," Vexi had observed, leaning forward with what Marcus had learned to recognize as intense focus. "When confronted with pain, most humans display predictable reactions: fear, anger, despair, defiance. You display amusement." "What can I say?" Marcus had shrugged. "I've got a weird sense of humor." "Demonstrate," Vexi had said, and made a gesture to something behind Marcus. The pain had been immediate and overwhelming, electricity coursing through his nervous system with surgical precision, targeting nerve clusters in ways that maximized agony while avoiding permanent damage. Marcus had arched against his restraints, every muscle in his body contracting involuntarily, his vision going white as his brain struggled to process the sensory overload. When it stopped, he'd been gasping, sweat pouring down his face, his heart hammering against his ribs. Vexi had watched him with clinical detachment, compound eyes reflecting the chamber's sickly light. "Fascinating," the interrogator had murmured. "Your physiological responses are entirely normal. Elevated heart rate, perspiration, muscle tension. But your psychological response." But then the absurdity of the situation had hit him. Here he was, strapped to an alien torture device, being electrocuted by a giant insect who was taking notes on his emotional responses like he was a lab rat in some cosmic psychology experiment. "Sorry," he'd wheeze between chuckles. "It's just, do you guys have a peer review process for this kind of research? Because I think your methodology might be a little biased." Vexi had gone completely still, a reaction Marcus was learning to associate with deep thought or confusion. The interrogator had made several rapid clicking sounds, then leaned back in what might have been surprise. "You are amused by pain?" "Not exactly," Marcus had replied, trying to find words for something he'd never really analyzed before. "It's more like pain is pain, right? It hurts, but it doesn't change anything. I'm still me, you're still you, and we're still having this conversation. The electricity doesn't make me less human or you less alien. It's just another variable in an already crazy situation. But surely you understand that this is merely the beginning, Vexai had said. The pain will increase. We have methods that can sustain agony for days, weeks. We can break your mind while keeping your body functional. Probably, Marcus had agreed. But here's the thing. Even if you break me, even if you turn me into a gibbering mess who tells you everything you want to know, it won't change the fundamental equation. You're still trying to commit genocide against my entire species, and I'm still going to oppose that in whatever way I can. The pain might change my methods, but it won't change my position. That was when Marcus had seen something he'd never expected to see in his Zephyrian's compound eyes: uncertainty. The sessions had continued for 2 more days, each one more intense than the last. Vexai had used sonic torture that made Marcus feel like his bones were vibrating apart from the inside. Chemical injections had triggered waves of nausea and vertigo so severe he couldn't tell which way was up. Electromagnetic fields had induced hallucinations and phantom pains throughout his nervous system. Through it all, Marcus had maintained his running commentary. "You know, this reminds me of a hangover I had in Bangkok," he'd said during the sonic torture, though the music was better there. "I hate to be critical of your technique," he'd gasp between waves of nausea, "but I think you might be overthinking this. Sometimes a simple beating works just as well." "Okay, I'll admit it," he'd wheezed during the electromagnetic session. "The light show is actually pretty impressive. Very artistic. You should consider a career in entertainment." Each joke, each casual observation, each moment of genuine amusement in the face of methodical torture seemed to disturb Vexai more than screaming or pleading would have. The interrogator began to spend long periods simply staring at Marcus, compound eyes tracking his facial expressions with the intensity of a scientist observing a completely unprecedented phenomenon. It was on the 7th day that Marcus was brought before the warlord. The command chamber of the Severed Claw was vast beyond human comprehension, a cathedral of alien architecture that soared hundreds of feet overhead and stretched out in all directions like the inside of a geometric mountain. The walls were covered in what looked like living coral, pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that shifted and flowed in hypnotic waves. The floor was a single piece of some crystalline substance that rang like a bell underfoot and seemed to extend down into infinite darkness. At the center of it all, on a raised dais that looked grown rather than built, was Warlord Kefar. Marcus had seen Zephyrians before, had fought them, killed them, watched them die. But the Warlord was something else entirely. Nearly 10 feet tall, even in its relaxed posture, its carapace was a deep purple-black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Ritual scarring covered every visible surface in patterns so complex they hurt to look at directly. Its compound eyes were larger than any Marcus had seen, and when they focused on him, he felt a weight of attention that was almost physical. But it was the warlord's hands that made Marcus understand he was in the presence of something truly dangerous. Where other Zephyrians had claws designed for combat or manipulation, Ketvar's hands were surgical instruments, fingers that could probably perform microsurgery or disassemble a human nervous system with equal precision. "So," the warlord said, its voice a harmony of tones that bypassed Marcus's translator entirely and spoke directly in his mind, "you are the human who laughs." "Among other things," Marcus replied, looking around the massive chamber with genuine appreciation. "Nice place you've got here." "Very spacious." Kefvar made a sound that might have been amusement or contempt. "Interrogator, Prime Vexai tells me you are unusual, that standard techniques have failed to produce the expected responses." "Well, I've always been a bit of a nonconformist," Marcus said. "My high school guidance counselor said I'd never amount to anything because I didn't follow proper procedures." "You mock us," Kefvar observed, but there was something in the warlord's mental voice that suggested curiosity rather than anger. Not really, Marcus replied honestly. I mocked the situation. There's a difference. The warlord rose from its dais with fluid grace, towering over Marcus as it approached. Up close, Marcus could see that the ritual scarring on its carapace wasn't random. It was a complex map of battles fought and victories won, a living record of conquests that stretched back decades or even centuries. Explain, Kefar commanded. Marcus considered his words carefully. This felt like a crucial moment, though he wasn't entirely sure why. You're a warlord of a species that's been at war with humanity for 17 years, he began. I'm a mercenary from a species that's supposedly inferior, but has somehow managed to fight you to a stalemate. We're enemies by definition, and both of us know that this conversation isn't going to change that fundamental fact. So the situation, me standing here in chains while you try to figure out why I'm not reacting the way your psychology textbooks say I should, that's absurd enough to be funny. But the pain you have endured is real, Kefar pointed out. The threat to your continued existence is genuine. Absolutely, Marcus agreed. But pain is temporary, and death is, well, permanent, but also not something I can control anymore. I made my choice back on that mining facility when I decided to let myself get captured instead of triggering the demolition charges. Everything since then has been out of my hands. Kefar circled him slowly, compound eyes reflecting the bioluminescent patterns on the chamber walls. Yet you chose capture over a meaningful death. You chose to preserve resources that will aid our war effort. This suggests either cowardice or calculation. Or curiosity, Marcus said. I wanted to see what would happen next. The warlord stopped directly in front of him, close enough that Marcus could smell the alien scent, something like copper and ozone, with undertones that reminded him of rain on hot pavement. And what do you think will happen next, human who laughs? Marcus met the warlord's gaze steadily, aware that this might be the most important conversation of his life. Honestly, I think you're going to kill me eventually. But I also think I've already accomplished something neither of us expected. Which is? I've confused you, Marcus said simply. You've been fighting humans for 17 years, and you thought you understood us. Fear, anger, desperation, defiance, those are the reactions you've learned to expect and counter. But you've never encountered a human who finds the entire situation genuinely amusing. And that bothers you because it suggests there are aspects of human psychology that your intelligence hasn't accounted for. Kefar was silent for a long moment, compound eyes shifting through colors Marcus couldn't name. When the warlord spoke again, its mental voice carried an undertone that might have been respect. You are not what we expected. None of us are, Marcus replied. That's kind of the point. Hashtag Actree. The weapon of laughter to change in his treatment was subtle but significant. Marcus was moved to what could almost be called comfortable quarters, a larger cell with actual furniture instead of bare walls, access to what passed for decent food among the Safarians, and most importantly, regular visits from Vex-Hi that had evolved from interrogations into something resembling conversations. Your species' capacity for adaptability is remarkable, the interrogator prime observed during one of their sessions, 3 weeks after Marcus's meeting with warlord Kefar. Our psychological profile suggested that prolonged isolation would result in mental deterioration within days. Instead, you appear to be thriving. Well, I've got good company, Marcus replied, gesturing to the small collection of personal items he'd been allowed to keep. A photo of his sister's family, a worn paperback book he'd been carrying when captured, and a metal coin he'd picked up on some forgotten battlefield years ago. Plus, these conversations with you are surprisingly educational. I'm learning more about Zephyrian culture than I ever did in military briefings. It was true. Vex-Hi had proven to be not just intelligent, but genuinely curious about human behavior in ways that went beyond simple intelligence gathering. Their discussions had ranged from philosophy to military history to the social dynamics of interstellar warfare. Marcus had found himself looking forward to the sessions, treating them as a form of intellectual exercise that helped keep his mind sharp. But he was also aware that something larger was happening aboard the Severed Claw. The ship's routine activities had shifted in ways that suggested preparation for a major operation. More frequent combat drills, increased communications traffic, and a general sense of anticipation among the crew that even Marcus could detect. "Big operation coming up," he asked during one conversation. Vexhi's compound eyes shifted in what Marcus had learned to recognize as surprise. "Your observational skills are impressive. Occupational hazard of being a mercenary," Marcus replied. "You learned to read the signs. So what's the target? Another mining facility? A civilian colony? Or are you finally making a move on one of the core worlds? Does it matter?" Vexhi asked. "Your opinion will not influence our strategic decisions." "Probably not," Marcus agreed. "But I'm curious. And if I'm going to die anyway, I'd like to know whether it's for something strategically significant or just another tactical raid." Vexhi was quiet for several moments, seeming to wrestle with some internal conflict. Finally, the interrogator made a decision that would prove more significant than either of them realized at the time. "New Geneva," Vexhi said quietly. "We will attack the colonial capital of New Geneva." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. New Geneva wasn't just another colony world. It was one of humanity's major industrial centers, home to nearly 50 million people and the primary shipyards for the Colonial Defense Force. In his voice level, "New Geneva's got some serious defenses." "Which we have studied extensively," Vexhi replied. "Our intelligence indicates that their orbital platforms can be neutralized within the first hour of assault. Ground-based installations will fall within days. The population centers will be pacified." The euphemism made Marcus's jaw clench, but he forced himself to maintain his composure. Getting angry wouldn't help Sarah or his nephew Tommy or the millions of other people who were about to become collateral damage in the Zephyrians' war of extinction. "Well," he said finally, "I hope you factored human stubbornness into your battle plans. We tend to be pretty unreasonable when our backs are against a wall." That night, alone in his cell, Marcus stared at the photograph of his sister's family and tried to process the knowledge that they were all going to die. Sarah had been 8 years old when he left for his first military deployment, and she'd grown up during his years of service, gotten married, had children, built a life that was everything he'd been fighting to protect. The irony that his capture had provided an intelligence for an attack that would kill her was not lost on him. But as he sat there in the alien darkness, surrounded by the subtle sounds of the ship's life support systems and the distant chittering of Zephyrian crew members, Marcus found himself thinking not about revenge or despair, but about the larger strategic picture. The attack on New Geneva would be a major escalation in the war. If successful, it would demonstrate that no human world was safe, that the Zephyrians had developed the capability to strike at the heart of colonial space. It would also likely trigger a massive human counter-response, possibly including the deployment of weapons that both sides had so far avoided using. But more immediately, it would expose something important about Zephyrian psychology that Marcus was only beginning to understand. They were afraid. Not of human military might, the Zephyrians had proven their tactical superiority in dozens of engagements. Not of human technology, their ships and weapons were clearly more advanced. They were afraid of something else, something that his own behavior had inadvertently highlighted. They were afraid of human unpredictability. The realization crystallized during his next conversation with Vexhi, when the interrogator made an observation that revealed more than it intended. "Your psychological profile has been distributed throughout the fleet," Vexhi mentioned casually. "Other interrogators wish to understand how you maintain emotional stability in the face of inevitable defeat." "It's gotten that much attention?" Marcus asked, genuinely surprised. "Warlord Kefar has declared your behavioral patterns to be of strategic significance," Vexhi replied. There is concern that other humans may exhibit similar anomalies. And there it was. The Zephyrians weren't just studying Marcus out of curiosity. They were worried that his reactions represented something larger about human psychology they'd failed to account for. His laughter in the face of torture, his casual acceptance of hopeless situations, his ability to find humor in circumstances that should have broken his spirit, all of it suggested that their psychological warfare tactics might be fundamentally flawed. "You want to know the secret?" Marcus asked. Vexai leaned forward with obvious interest. "Yes." "It's not that I'm not afraid," Marcus said. "I'm terrified. I know I'm probably going to die. I know my species fighting a war we might not win, and I know that everything I've ever cared about could be destroyed. But being afraid doesn't change anything, so I might as well laugh about it." "This makes no logical sense," Vexai observed. "Exactly," Marcus replied with a grin. "That's what makes it human." The conversation was interrupted by an alarm that sent vibrations through the ship's hull, not the sharp, urgent sound of a human klaxon, but a deep, thrumming note that seemed to resonate in Marcus's bones. Vexai immediately rose, compound eyes flashing with colors that suggested urgent activity. "What's happening?" Marcus asked. "Combat alert," Vexai replied, already moving toward the exit. "We have encountered resistance." As the interrogator left, Marcus settled back in his chair and began to laugh. Not the forced humor he'd been using as a psychological weapon, but genuine amusement at the cosmic timing of it all. Here he was, trapped aboard an enemy ship that was about to attack his sister's home world. And somewhere out there in the darkness of space, human forces were staging their own counterattack. The battle lasted 18 hours. Marcus experienced it as a series of vibrations, impacts, and changes in the ship's artificial gravity that told the story of a naval engagement more clearly than any tactical display. The initial contact, when human forces had apparently ambushed the Zephyrian fleet during their approach to New Geneva. The extended maneuvering phase as both sides jockeyed for tactical advantage. The desperate intensity of close-range combat when the ships shuddered under the direct hits and the lights flickered as power was rerouted to weapons and shields. Through it all, Marcus maintained his running commentary to the empty cell, treating the situation like a sporting event he was watching on television. "Oh, that was a big one," he said when a particularly violent impact threw him against a wall. "Somebody just ate a missile. Come on, humans." He cheered when the ship's engines went to full power, suggesting a retreat or tactical repositioning. "Show these bugs what we're made of. These bugs what we're made of." "Uh-oh," he muttered when the artificial gravity failed for several minutes, leaving him floating in zero-G while emergency systems struggled to compensate. That can't be good for anyone. When Vexai finally returned, the interrogator's usually immaculate carapace was scored with stress fractures and what looked like combat damage. One of its compound eyes was partially shattered, leaking fluid that steamed in the recycled air. "You seem to have had an exciting day," Marcus observed. "How'd it go?" "The attack on New Geneva has been postponed," Vexai replied, settling heavily into its usual position. "Your fleets were more prepared than anticipated." "We do like our surprises," Marcus agreed. "Casualties?" "Significant. On both sides." Vexai paused, seeming to consider its next words carefully. "Warlord Kefar wishes to speak with you again. Social call or business?" "I believe," Vexai said slowly, "that you may have been more strategically significant than any of us realized." The second meeting with Warlord Kefar took place in the ship's war room, a smaller but more intense space than the Grand Command Chamber. Holographic displays showed the tactical situation in brutal detail. Zephyrian fleet formations that had been mauled by human counterattacks, casualty reports that scrolled past faster than Marcus could read them, and strategic analyses that painted a picture of a military campaign that had gone very wrong very quickly. The warlord stood at the center of it all, its massive form somehow diminished by the weight of tactical failure. When it turned to face Marcus, the human could see new scarring on its carapace, not the ritual markings of conquest, but the rough, jagged lines of emergency field repairs. "Your people fought with unprecedented ferocity," Keflar said without preamble. "Our intelligence suggested they would attempt a defensive stand at the orbital platforms. Instead, they launched preemptive strikes against our staging areas and supply lines." "Yeah, that sounds like us," Marcus replied, studying the tactical displays with professional interest. "We're not really big on playing defense when we can help it. 3 of our heavy cruisers were destroyed in the first wave," the warlord continued, its mental voice carrying undertones of something that might have been respect or frustration. The human forces coordinated their attacks with a precision that suggests extensive preparation. Marcus felt a surge of pride that he tried to keep off his face. Somewhere out there, human commanders had anticipated the Zephyrian attack and prepared accordingly. Maybe his capture hadn't been as strategically meaningless as he thought. "But that is not why I brought you here," Keflar said, gesturing to one of the holographic displays. "During the battle, we intercepted human communications. Many of them referenced a specific tactical doctrine that our analysts had not previously encountered." The display shifted to show what looked like intercepted radio transmissions, the text scrolling past in multiple languages. Marcus caught fragments. "Remember Chen Protocol, laugh in their faces, Chen's last stand," before the display moved on to the next section. "Chen Protocol?" Marcus asked, feeling something cold and strange settle in his chest. "Named, apparently, for a human mercenary who was captured during a recent operation," Keflar replied, compound eyes fixed on Marcus with uncomfortable intensity. "The doctrine appears to center around psychological warfare techniques designed to unnerve Zephyrian forces through unexpected behavioral responses." Marcus stared at the display, watching as more intercepted communications scrolled past. References to death laughter, tactical recommendations about maintaining humor under torture, guidelines for using unpredictability as a weapon. It was all there, a complete tactical doctrine built around his own psychological quirks. "They named it after me," he said quietly. "Your capture was broadcast throughout human space," Keflar explained. "The survivors from the mining facility reported your unusual conduct during the siege. Military analysts apparently concluded that your behavior represented a previously unexploited form of psychological warfare. And now they're teaching it to other soldiers," Marcus realized, the full implications beginning to sink in. "More than that," the warlord said grimly, "our intelligence suggests that Chen Protocol training has been implemented across multiple military organizations. Colonial Marines, Defense Force regulars, even civilian militia groups. Your species has weaponized unpredictability." Marcus started laughing. He couldn't help it. The absurdity of the situation was overwhelming. Here he was, a small-time mercenary who'd spent most of his career as just another gun for hire, and somehow his smart-mouthed and inappropriate sense of humor had become a military doctrine that was apparently winning battles. "This amuses you?" Keflar asked, and there was something in the warlord's tone that suggested this was exactly the reaction he had expected and feared. "Are you kidding?" Marcus gasped between fits of laughter. "This is the funniest thing that's ever happened to me. I become a weapon of mass psychological warfare, and I didn't even know it." The warlord made a gesture, and the holographic displays shifted to show footage from the recent battle. Marcus watched in fascination as human pilots executed attack runs while laughing maniacally over open comm channels, as boarding parties maintained casual conversations while engaging in close-quarters combat, as ship commanders issued tactical orders with the kind of dry humor that Marcus recognized as distinctly human. "Your forces no longer respond to intimidation tactics as they once did," Keflar continued. "Fear-based psychological warfare has become ineffective. Our warriors report unprecedented difficulty in breaking human morale." "Because we're not taking you seriously anymore," Marcus realized. "We're treating this whole war like one big cosmic joke. And it is working," the warlord admitted, and Marcus could hear something like grudging admiration in its mental voice. Casualties among our forces have increased significantly since the implementation of this Chen protocol. Warriors who have faced hundreds of battles report being unnerved by human laughter during combat. Marcus looked around the war room, taking in the displays that showed Zephyrian tactical analyses, psychological profiles, and strategic assessments. All of it focused on trying to understand and counter a phenomenon that had started with one captured mercenary's refusal to take his situation seriously. "So what happens now?" he asked. Kethvar was quiet for a moment, compound eyes cycling through colors that Marcus had learned to associate with deep thought. When the warlord finally spoke, its words carried a weight that seemed to press against Marcus's mind. "Now, human who laughs, you have become too dangerous to live." The words should have terrified him. Instead, Marcus found himself grinning wider than ever. "You know what the funny thing is?" he said. "Killing me won't stop this. You can't unteach people to laugh. You can't make them go back to being afraid once they realize that fear is just another choice they can make." "Perhaps not," Kethvar agreed. "But we can ensure that the source of this infection spreads no further." "Actually," Marcus said, his grin becoming almost predatory, "I don't think you can." The warlord's compound eyes focused on him with laser intensity. "Explain." "You've been studying me for weeks," Marcus pointed out, "analyzing my behavior, documenting my responses, trying to understand what makes me tick. And all of that data has been recorded, hasn't it? Stored in your computers, analyzed by your best minds, discussed in your tactical briefings." Kethvar went very still, and Marcus could almost see the realization dawning. "Which means," Marcus continued, "that every Zephyrian in your fleet has been exposed to the Chen protocol. You've been teaching your own people how human psychological warfare works. And some of them, maybe not many, but some, are going to start wondering if maybe there's something to be said for laughing in the face of death." The silence in the war room was profound. Marcus could hear the subtle sounds of the ship's life support systems, the distant hum of the engines, the quiet cheering of crew members moving through the corridors. But from Warlord Kethvar came nothing, no movement, no sound, no mental emanations at all. "You're afraid," Marcus said softly. "Not of human weapons or human tactics or human technology. You're afraid that we might be contagious, that our way of looking at the universe might spread to your own people." "Impossible," Kethvar said, but the warlord's mental voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Marcus asked. "You've been fighting this war for 17 years. 17 years of conquest and slaughter and military glory. And what do you have to show for it? A stalemate against a species you consider inferior. Casualties that keep mounting. A conflict that shows no signs of ending. Don't you ever wonder if maybe there's a better way?" "Our way is strength," Kethvar replied, but now Marcus could hear uncertainty in the warlord's words. "Conquest is our nature. We are apex predators who have dominated our home system for millennia. And yet here you are, asking a captured human mercenary to explain why your psychological warfare doesn't work anymore," Marcus pointed out. "That doesn't sound like the behavior of an apex predator. That sounds like the behavior of someone who's starting to have doubts." The warlord moved then, crossing the distance between them in 2 quick strides and grabbing Marcus by the throat with one of those surgically precise hands. The grip was careful, tight enough to restrict airflow, but not enough to cause permanent damage. "You will not corrupt my warriors with your human weakness," Kethvar hissed, leaning down until its compound eyes were inches from Marcus's face. Marcus should have been terrified. The warlord's grip could have crushed his windpipe without effort, could have snapped his neck with a casual twist. Instead, he found himself looking into those alien eyes and seeing something he'd never expected to find there. Doubt. Too late, he wheezed through the constricted airway. "It's already happening, isn't it? You've got warriors asking questions they never asked before. Crew members wondering why they're fighting a war that never seems to end. Maybe even some who start to see the humor in the situation. Kefvar's grip tightened fractionally, and Marcus felt his vision beginning to tunnel. But even as consciousness faded around the edges, he managed to keep talking. "That's why you're really going to kill me," he gasped. "Not because I'm dangerous to your war effort. Because I'm dangerous to your worldview. Because if a human can laugh at death, maybe death isn't as final as you thought. And if death isn't final, maybe conquest isn't everything." The warlord released him suddenly, and Marcus collapsed to the floor, gasping and coughing as air rushed back into his lungs. When he looked up, Kefvar was standing over him, compound eyes reflecting the light from the holographic displays in patterns that seemed almost hypnotic. "You will be executed at dawn," the warlord said, but its mental voice carried no satisfaction, no sense of victory. "Your body will be ejected into space, and your influence on this war will end." "Will it?" Marcus asked, struggling to his feet. "Because I've got a feeling that the story of the human who laughed at the warlord of the severed claw is going to spread pretty quickly once word gets out. Humans love underdog stories, and this one's got everything: comedy, tragedy, and a really memorable ending." Kefvar turned away, but not before Marcus caught something in those compound eyes that looked suspiciously like regret. "Guards," the warlord called, and 2 warriors entered the war room immediately. "Return the prisoner to his cell. Maximum security protocols." As the guard secured his restraints, Marcus looked back at the holographic display showing the tactical situation. Zephyrian losses were heavy, but so were human casualties. The war would continue, probably for years, with millions more deaths on both sides. But maybe, just maybe, some of those deaths would come with laughter instead of screams. "Hey, Kefvar," Marcus called as the guards began to escort him from the room. The warlord turned back, compound eyes focusing on him with that familiar intensity. "Thanks for the conversation," Marcus said with a grin. "It's been educational." The last thing he saw before the war room doors closed was Warlord Kefvar standing alone among the holographic displays, surrounded by the data of a war that was no longer going according to plan. Back in his cell, Marcus settled into his chair and looked at the photograph of his sister's family. Sarah was safe, at least for now. New Geneva had survived the attack, and the Chen Protocol had apparently worked better than anyone could have hoped. The war would go on, but it would be a different kind of war, one fought with laughter as much as with weapons. As he sat there in the alien darkness, waiting for dawn and his appointment with execution, Marcus found himself thinking about legacy. Not the kind of grand, heroic legacy that military legends were made of, but something smaller and more personal. He'd become a footnote in military history, a tactical doctrine named after a small-time mercenary who'd refused to take his captors seriously. It wasn't the worst way to be remembered. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted his reverie. Multiple sets of them, moving with the coordinated precision of a military unit. Marcus stood up, straightening his torn uniform and running a hand through his hair. If this was his execution detail, he wanted to meet them looking as presentable as possible. But when the cell door opened, it wasn't Zephyrian guards who entered. It was Vex High, accompanied by 3 other Zephyrians whose carapaces bore markings Marcus didn't recognize. Their posture was different from the usual military bearing he'd grown accustomed to, more cautious, almost hesitant. "Hello, Vex High," Marcus said casually. "Come to see me off." In a manner of speaking, the interrogator prime replied, but its tone was unlike anything Marcus had heard before. "We have come to make you an offer." "I'm listening." Vex High exchanged rapid clicking sounds with its companions, then focused on Marcus with what seemed like nervous energy. "There are those among us who believe that this war has continued long enough, that perhaps there are alternative approaches to the current conflict." Marcus felt his eyebrows rise. "Are you talking about peace negotiations?" We are talking about possibilities, one of the other Zephyrians said, speaking in accented but understandable galactic standard. About questions that have been raised by your unique perspective on our situation. Questions like whether two species really need to fight to extinction over territorial disputes? Marcus asked. Among others, Vexai confirmed. Your behavior has prompted discussions that many of us never expected to have, about the nature of strength, the purpose of conquest, the meaning of victory. Marcus looked around at the four Zephyrians, trying to process what he was hearing. So what's the offer? Escape, Vexai said simply. We can arrange for you to reach one of your evacuation pods. Return you to human space. In exchange, I become evidence that there might be another way to end this war. Yes. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. It was a dangerous game these Zephyrians were playing, treason by any definition, punishable by death if discovered. But it was also an opportunity for something that hadn't existed since the war began. Hope for an ending that didn't involve the complete destruction of one species or the other. What about Kefvar? He asked. The warlord will discover your escape too late to prevent it, Vexai replied, and will face difficult questions about security protocols and the loyalty of the crew. That could get you all killed. Yes, Vexai agreed, but your species has taught us something important about facing death with dignity. Marcus started laughing again, but this time it was different. Not the manic humor of psychological warfare, but the warm laughter of genuine appreciation for cosmic irony. You know what? He said. I think I like this plan. When do we leave? The escape was almost anticlimactic. Vexai and the others had planned meticulously, timing their operation to coincide with the shift change in the security rotation. They moved through the ship's corridors with the confidence of crew members on legitimate business, accessing areas that would normally be restricted through a combination of stolen access codes and carefully forged authorizations. Marcus found himself in a maintenance section he'd never seen before, surrounded by the ship's life support infrastructure and the subtle vibrations of the engines. It was here that the conspirators had prepared an emergency evacuation pod, a small, cramped vessel designed for short-range transportation in case of catastrophic hull breach. The pod's navigation system has been programmed with the location of the nearest human patrol route, Vexai explained as they made final preparations. You should be picked up within hours of launch. And you? Marcus asked. What happens to you after I'm gone? We continue our work, one of the other Zephyrians replied. Quietly, carefully, but persistently. Your Chen protocol has given us tools we never had before, ways to question authority, to challenge assumptions, to find humor in situations that once seemed hopeless. The revolution will be laughed into existence, Marcus murmured, shaking his head at the absurdity of it all. Perhaps, Vexai said, or perhaps we will simply make it possible for our species to choose a different path when the time comes. The pod was ready. Marcus climbed inside, settling into the pilot's seat and running through the pre-flight checklist. Everything was functional. The navigation system was online, and the communications array would allow him to contact human forces once he was cleared the Zephyrian ship. One last question, he said through the pod's external speakers. Why? Why risk everything for one human prisoner? Vexai's compound eyes shifted through several colors before settling on what Marcus had learned to recognize as resolution. Because you showed us that there is strength in laughter, dignity in defiance, and hope in hopeless situations. These are lessons worth preserving, and worth dying for? Yes, all four Zephyrians said in unison. Marcus sealed the pod and initiated the launch sequence. As the small craft separated from the severed claw and accelerated away into the darkness of space, he found himself thinking about the conversations he'd had over the past month, the questions that had been raised, the assumptions that had been challenged. The war would continue, at least for now. But something had changed in the fundamental dynamic between the two species. The Chen Protocol had given humans a new way to fight, but more importantly, it had given some Zephyrians a new way to think. 3 hours later, Marcus was picked up by a Colonial Defense Force patrol cruiser. The crew treated him like a returning hero, eager to hear firsthand accounts of his capture and interrogation. But as he sat in the ship's medical bay, being treated for his injuries and debriefed by intelligence officers, Marcus found himself thinking about 4 Zephyrians who had risked everything to give him a chance at freedom. He never learned what happened to HFY and the others. Official reports indicated that several crew members of the Severed Claw had been executed for treason in the weeks following his escape, but there were no names, no details, no confirmation of their fate. What Marcus didn't know was that 6 months later, the first formal peace overtures in 17 years of war came from a faction within the Zephyrian hierarchy. The negotiations were tentative, limited in scope, and often broke down over seemingly minor issues, but they were happening, and that was more than anyone had dared hope for in nearly 2 decades of conflict. The Chen Protocol became standard training throughout human military forces, and Marcus found himself reluctantly famous as the man who had weaponized laughter. He gave speeches at military academies, consulted on psychological warfare tactics, and wrote a memoir that became a bestseller throughout colonial space. But his favorite appearance was at a small ceremony on New Geneva, where he was reunited with his sister and her family. As he stood there with his nephew Tommy, now old enough to understand what his uncle had done, Marcus thought about the strange path that had led him from a desperate last stand on a mining facility to becoming an inadvertent symbol of hope. Uncle Marcus, Tommy asked during the family dinner that followed the ceremony, "Is it true that you made the aliens scared just by laughing at them?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "Not exactly," he said finally. "I think I helped some of them realize that being scared isn't the worst thing that can happen to you. Sometimes being scared means you're still human enough to care about what happens next." "But they're not human," Tommy pointed out with the logic of a 7-year-old. "No," Marcus agreed, "but maybe that's not as important as we thought it was." Later that night, as he sat on his sister's porch looking up at the stars, Marcus allowed himself to think about HFY and the others. Were they still alive? Were they still working quietly to change minds and challenge assumptions? Or had they paid the ultimate price for their act of compassion toward a captured enemy? He would never know for certain. But sometimes, when the news reports carried stories of successful diplomatic contacts or rumors of peace negotiations, Marcus would smile and remember 4 aliens who had chosen to risk everything because a human prisoner had taught them how to laugh. The war wasn't over. It might not be over for years or even decades, but it was no longer the same war that had begun 17 years ago with mutual incomprehension and genocidal hatred. Now it was a war complicated by questions, tempered by doubt, and occasionally interrupted by the sound of laughter echoing through the darkness of space. And Marcus Chen, the mercenary who had learned to laugh in the face of death, had played a small but crucial role in that transformation. It wasn't the legacy he'd planned for, but as he sat there under the alien stars of New Geneva's night sky, he found it was exactly the legacy he would have chosen. After all, in a universe full of violence and hatred and seemingly endless conflict, what could be more important than teaching people, human or alien, how to find something worth laughing about? The revolution would indeed be laughed into existence, one smile at a time. Thesis. Epilogue. 5 years later, the peace treaty was signed on a neutral space station orbiting a star that neither species had ever claimed. Marcus Chen was there as part of the human delegation, not as a negotiator, but as a symbol, the man whose laughter had helped bridge the gap between 2 species that had spent decades trying to exterminate each other. The Zephyrian delegation included several individuals whose names Marcus didn't recognize, but their compound eyes held a familiar quality that reminded him of long conversations in an alien interrogation chamber. When the ceremonies were concluded and the formal documents had been signed, one of the Zephyrians approached him privately. "Marcus Chen," The alien said in perfect galactic standard. I bring greetings from Interrogator Prime Vexi. Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. Vexi is alive? Alive and well, the Zephyrian confirmed. Working as a cultural liaison in our new diplomatic corps. The lessons learned during your captivity have proven invaluable in preparing our people for peace. And the others? The ones who helped me escape? All survived, though their paths were difficult for a time. Your rescue created exactly the kind of questions about our methods and motivations that they had hoped for. Questions that eventually led to the conversations that brought us to this moment. Marcus looked around at the space station's observation deck, where humans and Zephyrians were mingling awkwardly but peacefully, trying to figure out how to interact with former enemies who were now supposed to be allies. So it worked, he said quietly. The Chen protocol actually worked. In ways that none of us anticipated, the Zephyrian agreed. You taught us that strength could be found in vulnerability, that wisdom could emerge from absurdity, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon is the simple refusal to take your enemies as seriously as they take themselves. As the alien moved away to rejoin its delegation, Marcus found himself standing alone at the observation port, looking out at the stars and thinking about the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. 5 years ago, he'd been a small-time mercenary facing certain death in an alien torture chamber. Now he was watching the birth of a new era in interstellar relations, one built on the foundation of shared laughter rather than mutual hatred. It wasn't a perfect peace. There were still tensions, still misunderstandings, still those on both sides who preferred the clarity of warfare to the complexity of coexistence. But it was a beginning, and beginnings were precious things in a universe that too often seemed determined to write endings in blood and fire. Marcus Chen, the mercenary who had laughed in the face of death, smiled as he watched the stars and thought about the future. It was going to be an interesting century. And somewhere in the depths of space, on ships and stations and worlds across 2 stellar empires, the sound of laughter echoed through the darkness. Human and alien voices joined together in the universal language of hope, humor, and the stubborn refusal to let fear have the final word. The revolution had indeed been laughed into existence, and the universe would never be quite the same.